first game against Ray Robson. This is round 1. Yeah, I got a pretty unfortunate colors this tournament. So I had 6 blacks and 5 whites, and I had black against all of the top seeds. So I had black against Dominguez, Wesley, Caruana, Shankland, and Robson, which is not particularly desirable. All of the guys who are known to be super theoretical I had black against, but it is what it is. It's based on a drawing of lots, so everybody draws a number from 1 to 12, and basically the first half has 6 whites and 5 blacks, and then the second half, the bigger the number, the worse your seeding is, basically, because the more blacks you have. That's just the way it works. I drew number 11, so not great. Yeah, I mean, starting with Ray with black is very, very difficult way to begin the tournament. And as you guys all know, I played the Alekhine, mostly because I wanted to throw everybody off guard this tournament. I knew that if I went into people's prep, I probably wouldn't have much of a chance. And mostly the strategy worked this tournament. I mean, it worked against Dominguez, it worked against Wesley, but here I took too much of a risk. The Alekhine is just not feasible, I think, against modern GMs who know what to do. And I think Ray demonstrated, really, not the refutation, but the line that comes as close as a line can come to the refutation, which is the 4 pawns attack. So e5, knight d5, d4, d6. And here, honestly, I was really hoping that Ray would go knight f3, which is the most popular move. This is the modern main line. And white is supposed to be better here as well, but after d5, knight e5, the sort of modern move is c6. And I analyzed this, and I felt like Ray in his online games was not too confident in these positions. And I thought I would have a pretty good chance to equalize. It's also very solid and positional. Ray is a very tactical player, so I thought I would try to take the game into a more quiet direction. But to my chagrin, and I knew that this might happen, Ray goes 4 pawns attack, c4, f4. And the first 11 moves of the game are the main line of the 4 pawns attack. I've done a speedrun game on this, so you could check out my video. I go in more depth on the actual theory of the 4 pawns attack. But so here I'm just going to go pretty quickly through the opening. Takes, knight c6. So the point is, of course, that black tries to attack white's center, and white tries to support it. Bishop e3 is very important. Not knight f3, because of the very unpleasant bishop g4, creating a nasty pin against the knight. So bishop e3. Basically, white waits for me to develop my bishop, my light squared bishop, and only then he goes knight f3. And the thing is, as I indicated in the speedrun, bishop g4 even here is a move. It's a legitimate line, but it's not very good. The loss of a tempo is too much to sacrifice here, and I think simply queen d2 is supposed to be good for white. I can sort of ruin white's structure a little bit, but it's not enough to warrant losing a tempo. Also, this pawn gets to f4. This is really bad. So I went for the main line, which is just bishop e7. And by the way, I think a lot of people have a tendency to develop the bishop here. But as I've indicated many times, when you're evaluating whether a pin is dangerous, there's 2 things to consider. The first is whether the pinned piece is defended by a pawn. If it is, it's very hard to put pressure on this knight. The second thing is how permanent or temporary the pin is. And here the pin is very temporary, because if white simply develops his bishop, then he is going to castle out of the pin, and the bishop is going to be left, the bishop is going to be left, it's like miners who come to California for the gold rush 2 years late. It's like all of the gold has been panned already. You're going to look awkward here. All right, so bishop e7, bishop e2, high and dry. That's a good expression. Castles, and f6, which is still considered the main line. Chipping into white's center, getting rid of the c5 pawn. Obviously, that comes at a cost, and the cost that it comes at is that the e6 pawn is now a pretty significant weakness. But at least optically, black's pieces look very nice. All of black's minor pieces seem to be doing something. Okay, so Queen d2, still theory. Connecting the rooks, and queen e7. This is basically what's known as the tabia, right? This is the moment at which white's got a couple of different ways to deviate. On the next move. So rook ad1, rook ad8. This is still my prep. There's still hundreds of games in this position. And the most popular move in this position is basically to say, all right, black has this pin going, and it's to move the queen back to c1. And here I had uncovered a really sexy sequence of moves, which actually equalizes for black. So this is really cool because most people don't actually know this. They play queen c1. What is this sequence? Well, black starts with e5. This does not look like a good move because of d5. But now black has a really, really cool sequence that exploits this awkward placement of the queen on c1. Does anybody know how black should continue? Or you can kind of intuitively sense what the next move is. It is very intuitive to play the next move, but what's not intuitive is sort of the follow-up to the next move. So you might be thinking, well, you don't want to go back to b8. That looks really bad. A tempting move is to play pawn e4, but this is the mupwa, the most popular wrong answer. And I think the reason this is bad is because, for instance, white can simply go back to e1. And as you'll see, there are two pieces hanging and no good way to defend them. Knight b4 is one of those moves that also looks, I guess it looks tempting because you're trying to get to c2, but not good enough because, I mean, again, even knight e1 here, attacking the bishop and covering the c2 square followed by a3, you're going to chase this knight away to a6. You don't want the knight to be exiled to Siberia. Yeah, the move is knight d4 actually. So this is a pawn sacrifice, as you can see. Knight takes d4, e takes d4, bishop takes d4, and here the crucial move. It looks like there's no compensation. The bishop is defended. But all of a sudden, it turns out that this queen on c1 is actually very poorly placed. And this next move is really hard to deal with. Yeah, bishop g5. All of a sudden, yeah, the queen has to go to a1, which is never a good sign. Now the initiative continues. You play the move c5, hitting the bishop on d4. And there's a lot of tactics here. The point is, if white takes en passant, there's a very simple sequence. Rook takes e3, bishop e3 check, and we win a piece. That's pretty easy. So the bishop has to drop back to f2. Now we go bishop c2. We hit the rook. The rook has only one feasible square, e1, and now rook takes f2. Rook takes f2, bishop e3. And this is supposed to be equal. There's a couple of correspondence games that went this way, but black has an initiative and enough compensation for the pawn. A big attack against the king, a pin. Everything is breathing. Objectively, it's equal, but white has to be very careful here. So there's still a couple of games in this line, which is pretty interesting. So I was really hoping that Ray wouldn't know this because it's not a commonly known line. But Ray took about 7 to 10 minutes here. I think he told me after the game that he did actually know this line. Or he didn't remember it, but he sort of reconstructed it. And he plays the best move, which is just king h1. This is the kind of move that takes the air out of the building completely. Very classy move. It completely removes any ideas connected with this diagonal. Like now, I will never have any kind of combination associated with like a check on e3 or a pin. And the reason I think people don't play this move normally is because they're afraid of this pin. But this is the nature of chess at this level, is you got to be incredibly concrete. Everything has to be considered concretely. You can't use general principles like, oh, there's a pin, I'm scared of this, so I'm going to move my queen away. You can't do that. Now, black has some attempts here like knight takes d4, but they don't work. For instance, let me try to remember why exactly this move doesn't work. I'm going to try to avoid using the engine when possible, but sometimes I'm going to confirm my conclusions of the engine. Yeah, so actually bishop takes d4 or knight takes d4 are both good. I think knight takes d4 is the reason I didn't do this. Bishop takes d4, c5. It looks like you're winning the bishop back, but white has the very powerful bishop takes c5. And you're hitting the queen, you have to take, and now white takes the rook. Boom, 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 boom. And already white is better, but now in comes g4, and the bishop is lost as well. So this is just really bad. Maybe g4 is not the most accurate, but either way, this doesn't work out. Okay, so I decided to make an improving move of my own, h6, which is still the best move, I think. Just, taking some squares under control. And Ray reciprocates with h3. Also, same kind of idea. We're both making some luft and improving our position. This is about where my preparation ended. I knew that this line existed. I checked it briefly before the game, but I didn't really remember what I had looked at here for black. So I took some time here, and I figured that my only real way to get this to work is to somehow put some pressure on the d4 pawn. I thought that if I don't find a way to pressure this pawn, black does not have a clear plan. That's actually the problem with this position. Because it's so hard to pressure this pawn, it's so well defended, black simply does not have a good way to improve the position, whereas white has a million ways that he can make small improvements and push me off the board. And this position is, practically speaking, really, really bad for black. Objectively, it's about 0.5. Thank you, MD Knight. I think to Michiko. So this is where I kind of started regretting my opening choice. Okay. So I played rook d7. I think very natural move. Either preparing to double or preparing to bring the queen back to d8. But the computer evaluation doesn't really matter here. It's more that it's very, very unpleasant. And only now does Ray play queen c1. He's made all these improving moves. Now he plays queen c1. And at this point already, the move e5 is no longer applicable. Because now after d5, knight d4, you can go down the same route. But there's no... the position has completely changed. There's no sacrifices. The king is safe. Black is simply down a pawn, right? So that doesn't work. Black has to play more patiently, so I played rook e8. I seem to remember that this was one of black's ideas. And basically, the point here is that I'm preparing... I'm trying to dissuade him from going d5. Pawn d5 is a pretty scary prospect, so what I'm doing is I'm doubling on a closed file, which is kind of a common technique to stop a pawn breakthrough. Because you're preparing for the eventuality that the file opens, and here I take on d5 and I'm hitting the bishop. I think this is a pretty good move. I don't think this is the big mistake. So Ray responds with rook d2. So clearly there's a lot going on in the d file. I play queen back to d8. Again, trying to put more pressure on d4, and he doubles rooks on d1. And yeah, this is where I was continually feeling worse and worse about my position. Now I realize that there's no clear continuation. I've done basically everything I can do, and there's no clear way to continue. I briefly considered e5, but after d5, knight d4, unfortunately, he doesn't play knight d4 and bishop d4. Now there's bishop g5 with a pin. But what he does is he plays bishop takes d4 and knight takes d4. And he hits my bishop on f5. So I don't have time to play bishop g5. Not good, right? If I move my bishop back, the knight gets into e6. This is a complete disaster. So what is the approach in positions where you don't know what to do? Well, generally, you try to make small improving moves. You kind of start playing the waiting game. And for two moves, we play the waiting game. First, I decided to play king h8, get my king out of the kill zone. Why couldn't you still play g5? That was never an idea. g5 is a little too crazy to weaken the king like this. I think king h8 is fine. Ray also plays the improving move b3. Just, because the bishop on f5 was hanging there. So, b3, solidifying the pawn chain. And I talked my bishop back on h7. I also thought this was an improving move because the bishop on f5 sometimes is hanging. So in effect, I'm trying to prepare e5 in some of these positions. Like now e5 is a potential idea. And Ray, I think, plays a really, really powerful move. I actually think the computer was indicating that somewhere around here, Ray had a slightly better way to improve his position. But actually, I think bishop h7 might be inaccurate. The computer indicates that this was really my only chance to improve the position of the knight on b6. Because now this knight is staring at the pawn and is obviously my worst piece. But where can this knight go? well, it can only really go in one direction, knight c8, knight d6. But the problem with going knight c8 is that you are taking your eyes off of the d5 square. So the move d5 always needs to be considered in response to knight c8. E takes d5, knight takes d5. But according to the computer, this position is actually not so bad for black. You can just continue with your plan and go knight d6. Very, very scary to be under this kind of pressure. But on the other hand, the knight's coming to e4. And there's a sense in which I think black has gotten a lot of counterplay here. So bishop h7 sort of missed the bus on that. And after a long think, Ray goes back to g1, bishop g1. Yeah. What is the idea? I think the idea is that after e5, now he can simply play d takes e5. And because I moved my bishop away from f5, it turns out that the rook on d7 is not well defended enough. After knight takes e5, bishop takes b6, white wins a piece. White wins a piece. Well, bishop g1, just getting the bishop off of the e file, I think, is the point. And black is losing a piece here. A takes b6, knight takes e5, the rook hangs. After rook takes d2, oh, he's even got knight f7 here, just winning the queen. Pretty straightforward idea. And here I lost my patience. So black's position is bad. It's just bad. There's no clear plan. And the way you know that is that the engine is indicating moves like a6, which basically signals that there's no further way to improve the position. But that was not acceptable to me. And I got impatient here. And I decided, based on a fatal miscalculation, to play knight c8. And to take this opportunity to improve the knight. Ray quickly goes d5, which I had anticipated. E takes d5, knight takes d5, and this is the critical position that I had spent maybe 15, 20 minutes evaluating. And as often happens in games of this level, ultimately the game is decided by a miscalculation. Right? It's not really a lack of understanding. You know, partly it's the opening, but what really decides the game is a miscalculation. So what did I miscalculate? I thought that I would play knight d6 here. Now, white can win a piece here, and I saw that. Who can spot the way that white wins a piece here? This is not what I missed. Yeah, very good. Knight takes f6, queen takes f6, c5. But that's not the end of the story, because I noticed that in playing h3, Ray had really weakened the g3 square. And I thought that I came up with a really sneaky idea to go knight e4, give the rook, and go knight g3, and knight takes c2. Okay, so what's going on here? The queen is hanging. And he has a very hard time finding a good square for the queen. Because if he moves it anywhere, then after queen f4, black gets at the very least a perpetual. So he has to move his queen while keeping f4 under control. There's two ways to do that. The first is to go queen c4. But now the queen is clearly on a very vulnerable spot, and black has a really, really powerful response that essentially forces a draw. Who sees it? Not knight a5, because then the queen can swing to h4, for example. It's actually, yeah, rook e4 is interesting, but the move is knight e5. Knight e5, yeah. And the tactical point is that if he takes on e2, I have knight g4 check, winning the queen. And what's even more important is that this is not checkmate, because I can block with my bishop. And if he takes my knight, well, then this is a draw. Queen takes e5, king h1, knight g3, and it's a perpetual. I don't think black has more than that. So that's line number one now. He's got one other way to defend f4, and that is to play queen d2. And here I thought that I still play knight e5. And I thought everything is great. I'm attacking the rook. He's still, I mean, it's the same exact point. I thought he has to take on e5, and then I win the queen, and I thought that black is a powerful attack here. But I completely overlooked the move rook d8 here. He can just move the rook. And I guess in my mind, I had assumed that after knight f3 gf, I'm going to have something against his king. But the king is, in fact, completely safe on h2. Black can resign. You have one check on e5, and now the very simple f4 decides the game. This is a really strong move. And it's over. Black's position collapses. I mean, knight f4, rook e8, and queen takes f4. Goodbye. And there's actually, wait, no, not queen takes f4. What am I saying? Sorry. So rook d8, boom, 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 boom. Ray pointed this out after the game. I didn't even notice this, but he can't take on f4 because of queen e2 check. But the simple queen d8 decides. Forcing the queen trade, black is down in exchange, that's it. Yeah, so I missed the move rook d8, and obviously I was horrified when I spotted this. So I also looked around in this position. I spotted a move like bishop f5 here. But after rook takes c7, I didn't see any kind of way to continue the attack, and I decided not to go. Maybe I should have gone for this and played something like bishop e4. The engine is indicating as an interesting try. If he takes, then there's queen f4, and I come back and take the rook, but the very powerful move queen d6 extinguishes the flames of black's attack. So this just does not work. And since knight d6 doesn't work, that means I have to keep my knight on c8, and that means the pressure on the d file is going to be completely overwhelming. And I didn't find any kind of way to put up a resistance here. I played the move bishop e4. The point is to try to force him to move the knight away from d5. But after knight takes f6, there's a further problem. Rook takes d2. He plays very strong move, knight takes d2. This is all based on a really, really beautiful tactical detail. The whole point of this is if you just take the knight, then after knight e4, rook e4, black is losing here. I mean, there's too many weaknesses. White's got two bishops. The knights are terrible. The rook is coming to f1. There's no forced win, but this is absolutely miserable for black. And in the long run, there's no way that black's going to be able to keep the king safe. Maybe this was objectively more resilient, but it's so miserable. I knew I was going to lose here. So I suddenly spotted a second idea that got me very excited for about a second. What did I spot in this position? And I had already seen this when I took on d2, so I spotted it when he took on f6. So obviously we know that loose pieces drop off. Always check for undefended pieces. There's an x-ray situation here. And there's another x-ray situation here. And so I took on g2. And this looks incredibly powerful. King takes g2, rook takes e2 check. And it looks like black's all of a sudden attacking. But king f1. Now what's going on here is that the rook is hanging, and currently white is up a piece. So if you just move the rook, then the knight's going to move back and white is winning. But the move queen d3 for a second looked winning for black to me. This looks like it creates devastating threats against the king, and if he moves this knight to hit the queen, then I've got queen f3 checkmate. Or I can cover with my rook on d2. And this is where Ray spotted an incredible move. It's not so difficult when you get to this position to see it, because there's nothing else to do. What is the game-winning detail? This didn't happen. This is the reason why I had to veer off the path. Yeah, queen b1. Quiet, but totally deadly, because you go straight to the linchpin. And no matter where the rook goes, you can give a double check, but then he's just going to take the rook. If you take the knight, then queen takes d3. There's a classic x-ray protection here. Rook takes d3, rook takes d3, white is up in exchange and winning. That's it. There's no squares for the queen. You can't move the queen and keep the rook protected. So unfortunately, now the computer indicated that maybe my last concrete chance was just to move the rook. And to basically say that white's king is still experiencing some discomfort. And I still have some attacking chances here. White is winning. It's +3, +4. But Ray would have had to be a little bit more precise than in the game. But I decided to go for a different defensive approach, which turned out to be losing essentially on the spot. I took on d2. And then I took on f6. Now, again, optically, it might look like black is still okay, because I've got a pawn for the exchange and his king is a little weak. The issue is that these knights are terrible. My king is incredibly weak, and this bishop on g1 is not bad. It's going to go out to h2 very quickly, and it's going to hit the pawn on c7. So I have to move my queen and keep f8 protected. I have to go back to d8, first he activates his queen. Now, queen trades are out of the question. They lose on the spot. So queen e8. And now he brings the queen to f4, threatening queen f8. I have to move my king. And unfortunately, I have to give up one pawn. Okay, I brought my queen out to e6. He simply brings back to g3. And now queen g4. He played very accurately. All engine moves here. Queen e7. And now in comes the bishop. Now everything is breathing. And there's no hope. I go back to f7. And now Ray finds a very, very classy sequence. Queen c8 check, king h7. Now, how does white end the game immediately? This is like a super, super classy move because it simply does not give any chances, even though it's not necessarily the top engine move. This is what I think some people don't understand. The engines don't always advocate for the approach of trading pieces. No, rook f7, I just take. Yeah, queen c7. This forces a queen trade. And obviously, this you can resign here. Queen f5 does not end the game. I have king g8. So queen c7. I played queen e4. This is a last-ditch attempt to organize some attack on the king, which, believe it or not, helped me last a couple more moves. Because after queen h1, white has to be accurate. King e2, but the problem is that if you give a check on d4, the king just walks up to e3. There's no anchor points. There's too many pieces surrounding the king. There's no threats. So he repeated once to gain time and make time control. Now, king d2. The king easily escapes the check. Knight d4. And now, I was hoping for some phantom threats, but he just goes back to f4. Queen c2 check, king e3, fearlessly walking into the center. The center can be the safest part of the board in these situations. That's another thing people don't always understand. But when you're in the center, you have the most escape avenues, and there's just no way to even give a single check. So knight back to e6, queen f5. One last trick that I found. If he takes on e6, I go queen e1 check, and I take the rook. White is still winning, but Ray, of course, avoided that and played bishop e5, getting the bishop in, hitting the queen. Knight g5 check. I knew that, this move loses on the spot, but I wanted to let him do something nice. Queen takes g5. And here I resigned, because if I give queen e1 check, it might seem like a last glimmer of hope, but the queen comes back to e3, and white is up a million things. So I resigned after queen takes g5. Yeah, very nice finish, and everything he did in the end was like top engine moves. He gave me zero, not even an inkling of a chance for counterplay. So, yeah, this was really, really nice. I mean, I didn't feel like I played terribly this game. I felt like I made a series of small inaccuracies leading up to one big mistake. But at the same time, Ray just played a, vintage Ray game. He was just incredibly precise. He knew the opening. The losing move, I think, is knight c8. I think the decisive mistake is knight c8, but black's position is already really bad. And I think, according to my hasty post-game analysis, playing knight c8 a move earlier would have been maybe a serious chance to get some sort of play. Because the difference is this bishop on e3 is very vulnerable. So now I can go knight d6. And he cannot do the same thing he did in the game. That was the point of bishop g1. It was a brilliant prophylactic move. Because he understood that the whole point here is that when he plays d5, my rook comes alive. So he neutralizes the effect of rook e8. Yeah, so first game was a loss, but not the most painful loss I've ever suffered by a long shot. And that got me to 0 out of 1. The second game against Jeffrey, I managed to win, and that was sort of my second best game of the tournament. And I'm going to leave the analysis of that game to tomorrow. And in the meantime, I'm going to go and get some rest. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the analysis. I don't mean to bore people to death. Just trying to give you guys an insight into what these games looked like. And, what was going through my mind.